It's time for Trivia Tracks with yours truly, Price Robertson, sponsored by Washita Valley Respiratory Care and Beth Smith at Edward Jones. One of America's worst serial killers, Albert Fish, committed at least 3 child murders from July 1924 to June 1928. He was also known as the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wysteria, the Brooklyn Vampire, the Moon Maniac, and the Boogeyman. He was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. The youngest of 3 living siblings adopted the name Albert after another sibling who had died. His father was 43 years older than his mother and aged 75 at the time of his birth. Fish's family had a history of mental illness. His uncle had mania. One of his brothers was confined in a state mental hospital, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illnesses, and his mother had oral and or visual hallucinations. In 1875, his father died of a heart attack, and Ellen Fish put her son in an orphanage. By 1890, the 20-year-old Fish had moved to New York City, where he engaged in male prostitution and began molesting and raping boys, mostly younger than 6 years old. Several years later, in 1910, Fish met 19-year-old Thomas Kedden. After 10 days, Fish took Kedden to an old farmhouse, where he tortured him over a period of 2 weeks. Fish eventually tied Kedden up and cut off half of his genitals. He chose people who were either mentally disabled or African American as his victims. By that time, Fish's wife had left him for another man. Fish tortured, mutilated, and murdered young children with what he called his implements of hell: a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. In 1924, he found 11-year-old Beatrice Keeld playing alone in her parents' farm on Staten Island. Luckily, the girl's family stepped in and forced Fish to leave. 3 days later, Fish murdered 9-year-old Francis McDonald, though he intended to castrate the young boy. In 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was next on Fish's list. And in 1928, 10-year-old Grace Budd became Fish's latest victim. Once she saw a naked Fish in the closet, she tried to run downstairs, but was stripped naked by Fish, then choked to death. After murdering his victims, Fish would cook their flesh and eat it for dinner. At one point, he started drinking his own urine and eating his own feces. It's safe to say that Albert Fish was miles farther down the toilet than Jeffrey Dahmer or Joe Metheny. Although police arrested 66-year-old Superintendent Charles Pope as a suspect in Grace's disappearance, accused by Pope's estranged wife, he was found not guilty. Fish, however, evaded authorities, having married Estella Wilcox in February 1930 and divorcing her after only 1 week. In November 1934, an anonymous letter was sent to Grace Budd's parents, which ultimately led the police to Fish. Albert Fish's trial for the young girl's murder began in March of 1935. The trial lasted 10 days. Fish pleaded insanity and claimed to have heard voices from God telling him to kill children. Several psychiatrists testified about Fish's sexual fetishes. None of the jurors doubted that Fish was insane, but ultimately, as one later explained, they felt he should be executed anyway. They found him to be sane and guilty, and the judge sentenced the defendant to death by electrocution. The man who so savagely murdered, mutilated, and cut young children to pieces was executed via electric chair on January 16, 1936. Till next time, I'm Price Robertson. Amazed by today's trivia? Then join me every Monday through Friday morning for Trivia Tracks on Fox Sports Camden 97.1.